Happy Hanukkah, everyone. The lights are growing. So beautiful. Hopefully some of you are in spaces where you can even enjoy the Hanukkah lights, even as we gather around our computers. Rabbi Eric, any other important words as we get started?
No, I'm just so honored and psyched to have Tema here. I've been a big fan on Twitter. I saw Jenny was making fun of me about that. It's okay. And I've been a great fan of Tema's writing in various places. Just honored to have her here, even though she's in Toronto. Happy Hanukkah, Tema. Welcome. Welcome to Raleigh.
All right, fantastic. So we will get started. Eric just offered a nice segue. He discovered Tema's writing on Twitter. Eric's trying to get more active on Twitter, one of his personal Hanukkah goals. And really over this last year, and every time he reads something bright and witty and incisive, he's like, we got to get her to come to Beth Myers. So it's truly an honor to welcome Tema Smith, who's joining us for Toronto. Tema has a very official professional bio as well as a not so professional bio, and they're both so extraordinary. I couldn't decide which one to share tonight. So I'm going to share a little bit of both. But we're really just looking forward to hearing Tema speak. Obviously, those of you who have registered to join know she's going to be speaking about her own experiences as a Jew of color, and then more broadly about this issue, and really in the spirit of us as a community continuing to grow our community, to celebrate Jews of color, and to make our community as inclusive, diverse, and embracing of anyone who wants to be a part of our community. All right, so here's a little bit about Tema. She is a diversity advocate, writer, and Jewish community builder. She's currently the director of professional development at 18 Doors, which is formerly Interfaith Family. It's a website and an organization that empowers people in interfaith relationships to engage in Jewish life and make Jewish choices, and encourages Jewish communities to welcome them. This comes after 7 years as a synagogue professional, most recently as the director of community engagement at Holy Blossom Temple. Isn't that an amazing name? Which is Toronto's oldest synagogue. Tema is also a contributing columnist at The Forward and My Jewish Learning. And she's dedicated to building a meaningful and inclusive Jewish community through research, training, writing, and relational engagement work. Over the last 10 years, she has worked to advance the conversation on racially diverse Judaism. All right, here's the not so professional part, but is equally awesome. Tema gets excited about good coffee. She had me at good coffee. Craft beer, especially if it's sour or funky, making playlists on Spotify, and going out dancing with friends, although probably not during the pandemic. Tema also lives with a chronic illness called, I might be getting this wrong, but ankylosing spondylitis, which is a kind of inflammatory arthritis that primarily affects her lower back, but also often causes joint issues and other unpleasant symptoms. She's involved in patient advocacy through the Canadian Spondylitis Association, and she writes about life with AS infrequently on her other website, Kiss My AS. Love that. She is often very online and has been called the nicest person on Twitter. That must be why Eric loves her Twitter handle. Chelsea Clinton even retweeted her. Tema lives in her hometown of Toronto with her sidekick, an 11-year-old extraordinarily stubborn Shih Tzu named Tashi, and his tiny buddy Padma, her pour-over coffee gear, and way too many books. And she already gave me a little heads up that Padma is probably going to make a cameo. She's here. So she's feeling particularly clingy, and I said that we welcome truly everyone, including Padma. So Tema, without further ado, we welcome you to our community, and we're so glad to have you here to share with us.
Thank you so much. The puppy will probably make a few more appearances. I've been really engrossed in the computer all day, and so this very needy 6-month-old is like, hello, why are you ignoring me? And fortunately, it's a teeny tiny dog and literally just fits on one arm. So it makes it pretty easy for me to talk, but I always warn everyone because sometimes he just tries to climb me and then like is just there. So you will probably see more puppy cameos. So thank you so much for that really kind introduction. It's so nice to be joining you. I wish I was there in person because even though I know it's chilly for you, your weather is better than ours right now. So the nice thing is that I can come to you from my little office wearing my cozy sweater, and it's a nice escape from the winter. I can pretend I am somewhere warmer. A little bit about me that isn't in my bio, that I think sets the stage a little bit for what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to tell a little story of my parents. So my mom is from Toronto. Actually, my grandparents were both born in Canada. My grandmother was born in Toronto, my grandfather in Montreal. And my mom was born here in Toronto. And at the age of about 22, she decided to run away to New York to go to art school and discover her Jewish identity. Our family was very Jewish, but very secular, and especially after her grandfather died. And Toronto Judaism at that time, and to this day, was quite small c conservative. And my mother, who was an artist, decided that, you know, New York is like the cultural mecca of Judaism. And so she petitioned the government to give student loans to a school that wasn't already listed and headed on down to New York. While she was there, she worked a series of under-the-table jobs as a Canadian citizen who was not eligible to work. And one day she was interviewing for a job in a bookstore in Greenwich Village, and it was snowing, and the owner of the bookstore sent the other guy out to buy her a coffee. The other guy was my father. He was not happy. But a few months later, they ended up falling in love and all of these things. And my mom married well, they came back to Canada. But my mom, in the meantime, ended up part of this New York Caribbean Catholic giant family. So my dad's family's from the Bahamas, but my dad was born in New York. And so my dad, unlike his older siblings, is very much grounded in being an African American, whereas his older siblings, who were born in the Caribbean, discovered that they were African American. And that way of thinking really informs a lot of the way that I think about race, that here's this family of 10 kids, and that 6 or 7 of them, I never remember where the cutoff is, discovered one day that they were Black. And the younger kids just always knew. And so this is something, so eventually being an interracial couple with no money in New York in the late 70s was not great. And my mom said, I'm going back to Canada, you can come or you can't, or sorry, I guess we're breaking up. And my dad followed, and the rest is history. And my dad arrived in Toronto, a very white city, with a Jewish fiance, into sort of a small Ashkenazi Jewish family who accepted him without really saying much, but obviously weren't really sure how to communicate it to the extended family. And where I like to start in this sort of personal story is with the anecdote that I think sets the stage for when I tell you the stories that I will about growing up mixed race and Jewish, and tying that to some of the recent occurrences in our community. So when my mother was marrying my father, they had just a city hall wedding. My dad wasn't Jewish, so they had explored whether my dad would convert. My dad really wasn't into the idea of converting. They said, okay, fine. They found a rabbi who would do it, but they had no money and they would have had to fly him in. So they said, nope, never mind. They had decided that kids would be raised Jewish, and so they had a city hall wedding. And 3 days before the wedding, my grandmother had not told her sister. And my mother was like, okay, this is not great. And so my mother called my grandmother's best friend and said, she's got to tell her, like, we're getting married in 3 days. She has to tell her. And lo and behold, my grandmother calls and she says, well, I told her and it wasn't that bad. And my mom's like, yeah, okay. And she says, I mean, all she said was, what do I care what color he is? A goy is a goy. And that sort of sets the stage for the family that I grew up in. So we had a very tight-knit, I usually tell this story backwards, where I talk about now and then go back to the 80s, but I guess I'm starting in the 80s today. We had a very tight-knit sort of immediate family, my parents and my grandparents, who were very close. They were our primary babysitters, but we were pretty cut off from our extended family. And our extended family were very involved in Jewish life, but my grandparents, for various reasons, were not. But they were heavily culturally Jewish. And my father, of course, had agreed that Judaism was the culture of our home. And at the same time, my mother had felt that it was really important to teach us Black history, and actually advocated pretty hard, not just for things like having the Christmas concerts renamed to holiday concerts in our school and adding the dreidel song, as was sort of the thing in the 80s, but also to have Black History Month in our school. So this is really, I grew up in a household where my father did this professionally. He worked in equity very early on in my life. And my mother, from sort of the perspective of being an advocate and a parent, really fought hard. But all of this was done sort of in not particularly Jewish contexts. And in retrospect, I recognize there were so many reasons that my mom did not feel comfortable in Jewish contexts. You know, the small c conservatism of our community. My mom grew up very poor, and of course, you know, synagogues cost money to attend. She wasn't particularly Jewishly literate. But then, of course, there was the elephant in the room of she was married to somebody Black, and people who know me, or people who know a lot of Caribbean. So Toronto's a little bit different in that so much of our Black community is Caribbean, and Caribbeans will be able to tell instantly when I walk into a room that I'm mixed 99% of the time. And my brother's darker than me and has tighter curls. So she had kids that kind of obviously looked mixed race. And so we explored and nothing really fit, and it felt weird, and we didn't really explore that much. My father felt really uncomfortable. And so we didn't really do Jewish. We did it at home in our sort of cultural way. And as I got older, I had a lot of questions. And so my Jewish journey is very much self-directed. And really what happened, I went to university, I was studying philosophy, and I realized that all of the philosophers who I was like really jiving with were all Jewish. And so I started being like, hey, what's that about? And one thing led to another. I did a year in Israel in grad school, came back, and within a year I was a Jewish professional. That's a very truncated story. But I've been thinking a lot about like what changed for me. And what changed for me was that when I was in Israel, I happened upon a group of friends that were American Jews who were really thoughtful and creative and really activist-y in that they would show up for racial justice in the US. They were, and it was a very sort of pluralistic group of people. It was a multiracial group of people. And it was the first time in my life where I had experienced a Jewish community that looked like that. And then of course, extrapolating out, you know, in Israel, where this was 2008, 7, somewhere in that range, seeing Jews that looked like my brother and seeing Jews with giant curly hair that was giant and curly and out, you know, seeing Jews who looked like what I didn't realize we could look like. I mean, intellectually I knew, but it's very different when you're walking up and down the street and just seeing a community that looks like that. And I think in retrospect, that was a moment for me. That was a turning point. And I came back, and then, of course, I moved back to Toronto, settled back into this very sort of white Jewish community. And right away, I started asking, like, okay, my mom married somebody Black. Like, there's got to be other people like me out there, whether they're people who are like me who are mixed, or whether they're people my age who are partnered with people who are Black or another race or whatever. And I eventually started trying to build that community here. And it happened in fits and starts, and then it kind of died out. So fast forward to now. More and more attention is being paid, of course. And so the story that I really want to start with to frame where we are right now is what I think is this watershed moment that we're in. And the reason that I say it's a watershed moment is I think we've had so much building. First of all, there's just been this growing awareness in the last, say, 5-ish years that the Jews of color in our community aren't showing up, and that there's something wrong. Like, we know that people like my family exist, but why aren't they walking into our community buildings? So that's been sort of a big feature of the last 5 years, and so much attention's been paid to it. You know, at the biennial, for example, at the Reform Biennial, not just last year, but also 2 years prior. And other sort of major Jewish organizations are starting to say, like, hey, hold on, what's going on here? But I think it's really reached a tipping point, or a watershed moment, or whatever. I should choose one metaphor and stick with it. And I think that watershed moment happened this summer. And so that's where I'm going to go for the last few minutes before I open the floor to questions. So this summer, of course, we all know the racial justice sort of reckoning that America, but also Canada, is not immune to any of it. I spend my time really, even though right now my physical body is planted in Canada, I probably actually spend 75% of my Zoom time south of the border. And what was fascinating to me, and what sort of really, the way that I've sort of been constructing this story as I try to make sense of what's going on, goes something like this. So of course, you know, we know that this sort of spilled over when George Floyd was murdered. But actually, I think the Jewish community's reckoning started a week earlier. And why do I remember it's a week earlier? I was on vacation, and an article came out in E-Jewish Philanthropy, which is basically like the trade blog of Jewish professionals, that was a preview of a chapter of the American Jewish Yearbook. And it was co-written by 2 of the leading demographers of Jewish life. They've done tons of federation studies across the country. And what they did was they looked at a study that had been published a year prior that suggested that there had been a systematic undercounting of Jews of color. And they tried to sort of reconstruct in a different way and said, actually, no, the study's wrong. There was no systematic undercounting. Our count was right in the first place. Now, as I always say, I am not a statistician. I haven't taken math I stopped after the 10th grade when they didn't make us do it anymore. So this is well beyond me. However, my issue is less about how many Jews of color there are and nitpicking over, is it 5%, is it 15%? But it was the way in which the question was asked by the people who were looking to sort of set the record straight and reassert that they had been correct. They asked the question in a way that was just full of what one could call microaggressions. And what happened was, in the comment section, it just blew up. People were showing up and saying, like, whoa, 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 have you considered, like, you're actually not looking at the premise of what these other people tried to do, which was say, since the question about race hasn't been asked, and we use other statistics to try and fill in the blanks, let's guess that this is where we are. So people were coming in and saying this. And one of the authors was jumping in to respond things like, of course I'm not a racist. I sponsor scholarships for Ethiopian Jews to go to university in Israel, which is probably not the best way to address questions about whether your research methodology is sensitive to undercounting people of color who tend to be undercounted in communal studies. And this kind of went on for a while. And you might be aware of it, there was like a whole flurry. Rabbi Rick Jacobs ended up outright calling the authors racist. I stopped short of doing that. It's not my personality. That's not, but I wrote a piece saying, like, whatever the number is, the reality is that nobody has bothered to actually count how many Jews of color there are. And I think really often of my friend and colleague, Ilana Kaufman, who runs the Jews of Color Initiative, which is essentially, it's a capacity building organization that's funded by a number of the large foundations that gives grants, but also does leadership trainings and education. And they're the ones who commissioned this report. And she gave a few years back, there were these things called Eli Talks that were basically TED Talks, but for the Jewish community. And she gave one that was all about, it was called Who Counts? And it was looking at the question of, and she looked through Torah and at all the times that the Israelites were counted. And she says, as a people, like, we actually really care about how many of us there are. We do these community studies. Every synagogue wants to know to the exact number how many members they have, all of these things, but we are systematically missing out on people, which if you're not counting in the census, if you're not being counted in the census, you don't really exist. And so really all of this sort of set the stage. This conversation was mostly happening in Jewish professional spheres for that week, but it really set the stage that then when George Floyd was murdered, the floodgates opened. People really stopped and said, whoa, hold on, there's a lot that I'm missing here. And when I think about what's happened since then, so much. I have spoken to so many people, and it's really been just wonderful and reassuring. At the same time, I'm seeing growing racist attacks, unfortunately, predominantly on Twitter, where the worst people hang out on Twitter. The best people hang out on Twitter, and the worst people hang out on Twitter. But just today, a blog called StopAntisemitism.org, I believe, just named a Black Jewish woman as their anti-Semite of the week, which she happens to have far left Israel politics, but they've gone through her history to try and prove that she was actually raised Episcopalian, which she wasn't, like really problematic stuff. And unfortunately, as the question of inclusion and, Jews of color standing up and saying like, hey, we're here, our community has some issues that we have to grapple with, those of us who have been most vocal have had giant targets painted on our backs, unfortunately. And it's by our fellow Jews, which is, again, when I tell this story of my childhood and why my parents might not have walked into our spaces, I feel that acutely. And for me, it's been a real sort of, I don't know the word that I want to use. It's been a journey. It's been painful. I've cried a lot. I've yelled a lot. I've had phone calls with other Black Jewish professionals, just sort of yelling into the phone, like what do they call it, where you just like the silent scream of anguish or whatever, because at the same time that we're all dealing with sort of the personal emotions that come along with this reckoning, we're also, and like I'm an educator by nature, I don't process on my own, I process by talking to people, but we're all talking a lot, and we're bringing people along on journeys that we've had to go through because of who we are. And I keep trying to find the tie-in to Hanukkah, because that's why I'm here. And I think the tie-in to Hanukkah that I'd like to share and then talk a little bit more, because I know if I don't do this now, I will forget, is that my brother, who is not involved in Jewish life, is married to somebody who is not Jewish and white, although has a Jewish connection in her family as well, but is not practicing. And this year, my mother called me and she said, "I don't even think your brother's lighting the menorah." And my mom, and she's, very upset about this. And she also feels like the weight of not having brought him into Jewish life because of the various concerns around how we would be perceived in Jewish life. And she's really feeling this weight. And and also my brother, by the way, is like blissfully ignorant of all of these conversations about race in the Jewish community, which has been fantastic because, as an example, his name is Asher, and he used to manage a restaurant in the neighborhood where Holy Blossom is, a very heavily Jewish neighborhood. And people would regularly say things to him like, "Oh, Asher, did you know that's a Jewish name?" Or, "Oh, Asher, that's Hebrew. Did you know that?" And my brother, being sort of clued out, is just like, "Yeah, I know, I'm Jewish," and like moves on. At the same time, I saw the way his face lit up when Drake broke onto the scene. And of course, if you don't know Drake, he is a rapper. He's from Toronto. So of course, Toronto's already proud of him. But his mother is Jewish, his father is Black. So all of us mixed race Toronto kids are proud of him, and all of us mixed race Toronto Jewish kids feel a special connection. And incidentally, he's my friend's cousin, because of course. And my friend is a Jewish professional as well. So Drake has Jewish professionals in the family. And so I see that sort of back and forth of, on the one hand, he's just so comfortable with the fact that he's Jewish. On the other hand, he's so distant from it. And this year, with his wife and his stepson, he called my mom and he said, they put up one of those giant inflatable Santas, and my brother called my mom and he said, "I think we need a light up menorah next year. It's too late for this year." And then he said, "Hey, how does oil work?" Because of course we always had the candles. And so my mom just sent him the little cups full of the jellied olive oil, and he's been lighting the oil and he's so excited. And when I think of sort of a vision of our community, I think of a vision where we would take for granted, first of all, that Asher, with the Hebrew name, knows where his name comes from, but also that my brother would have been involved in Jewish life from day one, because there wouldn't have been concerns about how he would be perceived in our spaces. And I've been obsessed with Judaism as long as I can remember. My mother's joke is like, "We don't know where this came from, but hey, that's it. Somehow you came out extremely obsessed with this stuff." But what I find so exciting, and my Hanukkah sort of excitement, is seeing this picture of my brother. He took a selfie as he was lighting these oil candles, and he texted them. My mother was here. We're locked down, so my mother and I are a bubble. So I see a lot of my mother. But he texted us this picture as we were lighting our candles. And I don't really know how we get there, other than bit by bit. Every committed person who believes that our community should be looking different than it is, should represent the actual people within our community, educates one more person. Everyone takes that pause the next time they wonder to themselves, I wonder how that person got to be Jewish, and sort of self-corrects. And these are the moments that I think are so profound and powerful, and just have this really, that really salient ability to just like change the world, is if each one of us who hears a story like the one that I'm telling you passes it on to the next person. One of the things that has been the hardest for me is that because I look the way that I do, I hear the things that people say when they don't think there's somebody Black around. And as a Jewish professional who works in community, that means that I unfortunately get to hear people's reactions to talk about race, people's reactions to news items, all the time in the way that they would never react if I looked more like my brother. And people always are like, oh, you have such a thick skin. And I do, because I have to. And that is another thing that I think we all have the power to change. I could share anecdotes. I think I'm not going to, actually, because it's Hanukkah and it's a time of celebration. Catch me not during a time of celebration. I'll tell you all the anecdotes. But one of the things that I think, again, is most powerful, I found my Hanukkah tie-in. Yes. I've been trying since I was invited to come up with a Hanukkah tie-in, and it just dawned on me, and it's great. We all have the potential to be the shamash, the server candle, lighting the light of the community we want to build with the next person and the next person and the next person. And that's why I do this work. This is not my full-time job. My full-time job is training professionals to work with interfaith families. Of course, sometimes that does touch on the questions of race, but that's not the primary sort of concern of my job. I look at the community that I've managed to create for myself, despite all the barriers, despite all the challenges, despite not finding people who look like me or come from families that look like mine until very recently. And I look at that and I say, what would it look like for the next generation to not have to look so hard? And it's happening. One of the things that gets me so excited is looking at Jews 10 to 15 years younger than me who are coming up in leadership roles and who are our teens in programs. I've given a few talks to teen programs in like suburban Jewish communities, and there's always 1 or 2 kids of color in these groups. And just looking at, this isn't sort of an option that we can pursue racial justice within our community or not. It's a necessity at this point. This is who's here. And so when it's like the conversation that communities had a number of years ago about interfaith families that I think about often. There's no the number is not going to get smaller, and we as a community have an option, have a choice about whether we embrace the people who want to be here with us or not. And so when we're having this conversation, just a few sort of closing thoughts, and then I will open the floor, because I hope we can have like a conversation, or you can ask questions, all sorts of things. One of the things that's been really interesting to me about maybe the slight nuance though about this conversation is that showing up for Jews of color also means showing up for racial justice more broadly. And so I'm going to close on an anecdote, which is a story that I wrote in the wake of George Floyd. And it's the last thing I wrote. It's like pinned on my Twitter, but it's also on the forward. And basically, my editor kept bugging me, like, are you going to write? Are you going to write? Are you going to write? And I kept sort of saying, yeah, sure, I'll write eventually. And I was just unable, just absolute writer's block. And then but I had this refrain that kept coming back to me, which was, I don't think any of my Jewish friends gave their kids the talk about the police. And that was eventually what the story ended up being, or the start of the story ended up being, that I realized all of the different ways that I learned to protect my brother from racism, really subtly, in that I sort of realized it as I was writing this story. I remembered times when my father was racially profiled while I was there. And we learned to laugh it off, because what else do you do? And so as I was thinking of this moment in our national history, combined with this moment of like, who's in our community and why don't we know and why aren't they showing up? At that moment, I realized that there's this sort of divide that we need to bridge by talking, because people don't understand that sort of visceral experience of, in my case, because I pass as white, I don't directly experience these sorts of things, but the visceral experience of watching my parent get racially profiled, of learning not to let my brother walk around the convenience store by himself, and little pieces like that are happening within our community as well. And so my biggest call and desire, again, the sort of Shamish image, we have this great power in each and every one of us who wants the community that we live in, that we care about, our Jewish community and our broader community, to be just and to be welcoming and to really reflect the people who belong. To take it upon yourself to pass on that call. And bit by bit, we will build this place that we want to see. And I do this work because I'm hopeful, and I do this work because I'm seeing the change. If you had told me even a year ago that between June and December, I would have talked to like well over 10,000 people, probably more, probably much more than 10,000 people about race in the Jewish community, I would have said, nah, that's not possible. But this is where we are. And my biggest hope right now, that's also my biggest fear, I really hope that we keep doing it, because I'm a little bit scared that when the pandemic is over and things go back to some new normal, that we'll just stop. So please, from my heart, you all showed up to listen to me ramble tonight. Thank you for that. But take the sort of spark that's within yourself of wanting to see a community that reflects everyone in it, and please just keep lighting those fires.
Wow, thank you so much, Tema. Yeah, I wish you could, hopefully you can see in gallery view some of the hand snapping and clapping and showing appreciation for what you shared. So as Tema said, we really want this to be a conversation. So we invite you either to unmute yourself and feel free to use your voice and ask a question or make a comment, or feel free to use the chat. I will keep my eyes on the chat box. Sometimes it's helpful when you're asking a question or whatever, you could put it in all caps, but however you decide to put it in the chat box, I'll keep my eyes on that as well. I love that, Tema, you ended on a note of hope. For me, hope is really one of the core mandates of what it is to be a Jew, that we're always, even God's name, Moses asked God, what am I supposed to call you? And God says, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, I will be that which I will be. There's this future quality that we're always kind of dreaming of a world and possibilities, yet unfulfilled, but that's who we are. And I'm so excited that we get to be a part of this with you and sustain this conversation, not only have this conversation, but sustain it so that we can really create the kind of community that reflects who we actually are, and build the one that we want to be in. So want to open it up to any folks who have questions.
And as people are thinking, I just want to say you reminded me when I talked about being in university and being drawn to all these Jewish philosophers, what I was drawn to was their ideas of basically, I could go on this could be a whole other long spiel. It's very academic, but their idea of the future. I was so drawn to this idea of striving to something that may never show up, but we don't get a chance to sit down and pretend that we're not striving towards it. And that was actually my gateway drug, was this idea of messy, the language. It was Jacques Derrida, who I studied. He called it messianicity without the Messiah. And that was what sucked me into Jewish professional life somehow. I don't know.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much. All right, Steve Hamill has a question. Steve.
Hi, thanks very much for your insight. Appreciate it. So by virtue of the fact that we're all here tonight, generally speaking, we're probably all decent people. And we're all decent congregants. And are there things, I guess just from a practical standpoint, when we're at the synagogue or when we go back to the synagogue, are there things that we either can do or should not be doing to be welcoming Jews of color? Things to do, things to say, things not to do, not to say?
Yeah, sure. So there's all sorts of things. So I would say like the top ones are, if a person of color walks in, assume that they know what they're doing there. I've heard one of my first sort of big projects that led me to develop a lot of training was I was hired by the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College to talk to do a virtual listening tour with Jews of color who were either in rabbinical school, had recently finished, or were thinking about it. And so this is like, leadership, Jewish communal leadership. And every single one of them had a story of either being asked to tell their story, being mistaken for the janitorial staff, or some other experience that was just not great, not great. And of course, there's nothing wrong with custodial staff, but when you mistake your synagogue's youth director for the custodian because she happens to be a Black woman, not great. So that's the obvious one, is just assume that when people walk in, they know what they're doing there. The other one I would say, and this is something that I think we're building towards, right now, the vast majority of times that Jews of color are seen speaking to congregations, it's about the experience of being a Jew of color. What would it look like if, like, the people speaking, like, I'm just going to make a joke. I got invited to a synagogue to talk about Jacques Derrida's idea of messianism, rather than, and like, I'm a trainer on diversity, like, it's different, that's what I talk about, but so many of us, even those of us who aren't actively doing this, are asked to talk about their experiences. And I'm actually moderating a panel at a fundraiser on Thursday with 3 Black Jews. And a week ago-ish, there was a conversation here in Toronto between, I think, 4 Black Jewish artists, maybe 5, I can't remember. And the conversation came around to this idea of like 2 things. One, it was so refreshing for all of them on this panel to just be there talking about like being artists and how their Jewish identity and their Black identity informs their art. And they weren't talking about being, bugged at synagogue or like not seeing themselves represented. They were literally just talking about being Black and Jewish as artists. And they had this moment, and it was sort of like this group of epiphany of like, hey, maybe this is what like Black Jewish joy looks like. And so we're now talking about this. One of those panelists is on this panel. So we're now talking about, what does Black Jewish joy look like to you? And what does it look like that when we host these community conversations that Black Jews, I speak from the perspective of Black Jews, I don't pretend to know the experience other than what I've been told of other racialized groups. But what does it look like just to be and to teach whatever, not about our identities? And, I think that's a really major thing for us to work towards. The other question that I think is a harder question, and like, I don't know what you all do for security at your synagogue, but like the hard question, of course, is synagogue security. And there's no right answer on that, but there are growing questions about what does it mean. We've had this big sort of national awakening at how particularly young Black men are not necessarily safe when they meet police, and what does it look like in our community settings. I don't have an answer for that. I always say, like, I wish I had an answer for that. I also know that I've worked in Jewish communal buildings for 12 years of my career. Like, I understand the need for security, so there is no right answer. And then I think also just engaging in that continuing process, I call it the process of learning and unlearning. On the one hand, I think one of the big mistakes that I'm seeing is that synagogue committees especially are like, we need to act and become anti-racist, and we're gonna, put together a tutoring program for poor Black kids or something. I'm being sort of facetious. This is sort of a broader thing that I've seen happen. Rather than spending the time doing the deep work of like, understanding how racism plays out in our lives. I think really often of Holy Blossom, my home synagogue, which is one neighborhood over from a historic Caribbean neighborhood. And like most of the people don't even know that. And so just like, what does it look like to unlearn sort of the way that our society is segregated, unlearn all of the racism that we've been steeped in. And I think really often there's a great set of videos. I haven't actually read the book yet. I recommend this to everyone. And the book is called Biased, and I have to turn around and look because I forgot her name again. Jennifer Eberhardt. It's a good thing I have my bookshelf right there. Jennifer Eberhardt wrote this. She's a Black woman. She's a behavioral psychologist, I believe. But she wrote a book about how bias functions. And she has a series of videos talking about it. And just really, spending some time delving into that stuff. And what I love about it is she also talks about how like also people of color share these biases because they're just what we're all steeped in. And so spending some time with that. I hope that answered the question. Just to sum up, don't spring into action, spend some time learning and unlearning, and really do that deep work as a community. Assume that Jews of color who show up know what they're doing there, and seek out Jews of color to teach on things other than the fact that they're Jews of color.
Fantastic. Okay, others. And maybe Susan Ehrlich, great.
Just really enjoying all that you're sharing tonight. And I'd love to hear a little bit about your interfaith work, because a lot of what you're talking about, there's clearly an intersection. So if you can just elaborate on some of that. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. So my day job, so 18 Doors as an organization, we have sort of two different avenues of doing this work. We run a website and we have programming and everything like that interfaith couples and families can come to get access to accessible Jewish content. And some of that is like run by rabbis, where we'll have discussion groups about, couples that are preparing to get married or recently married, discussing like how faith plays into their life and things like that. We've been around since about 2001 and have evolved over the years. We have a website with tons and tons of resources, articles, recipes, all sorts of things. And then we have our professionals facing side, which is really two parts. We have a rabbinic fellowship that one of my colleagues runs, and then I do our professional development work. I've only been there for a year, so this is something that is going to continue to be built. But because of the pandemic, it was kind of like, we started to build and then we pivoted and then we pivoted again and then we pivoted again. But my work really is predominantly with, I run webinars every month, usually, and I'm building e-learning that people can do on their own time to learn some of the best practices for engaging interfaith families. So we spend a lot of time working on questions of like, how do our biases about how interfaith families do or don't do Jewish inform the work that we do with interfaith families? What are the like basics of engaging interfaith families? Like, what do we hear from the families who we work with who aren't plugged into synagogue life about what they're looking for, and all sorts of pieces like that. And then I also draw from my years working in synagogue. So for example, when COVID started, and I started getting questions from rabbis being like, hey, like, actually, what do I need to know? Like, if interfaith families in my community start experiencing death, and like, I don't do the pastoral side, but having worked in synagogues for a number of years, I like ran a webinar on like all the administrative stuff that you need to, and policy stuff that you need to have figured out before you get a phone call, and you've never been put in a situation where you have to figure out who can be buried in your cemetery and things like that. So it's a pretty broad range of things. We also do leadership initiative and community consulting, and like on-demand training. Like, synagogue will call me and say, we need training on thing X, and I'll put something together and do it. Either once upon a time, I would get on a plane and fly and do it in person. Now it's Zoom. and all sorts of things. So our real view is that interfaith families are here to stay. Most of us on our staff are from interfaith families and are deeply committed to Jewish life, and that we have a choice to make as a community, and to see us as strengths or not. And we choose the side of viewing interfaith family as a strength, because we are the majority. So, so it's you know, again, that real sort of posture of hope that this is a group of people within our community who can actively play a role in the community that we're in, and is also underrepresented in synagogue life and in federations and day schools and all of these things. So it really, like, these are my passions, and like, I'm an educator by nature, I'm an educator by training, and that's sort of how I fell into this, incidentally, you know, in that sort of idea that things are meant to be. I was in my adult education class. They always did one class at the end of every class, at the end of every term, about the job market, when I got a ping from a friend that this job was posted. So it was totally beshert, totally meant to be, and now this is what I do for a living, and it's great.
Wonderful. So getting a question now from Diane. As a Jew of color, I want to thank you for explaining and supporting much of the conversation that I'm currently engaged in.
Thank you. One of the things that's been so encouraging, reifying, all these different words for me, is hearing from other Jews of color, their experiences, number one, but also like building this virtual community of people who are living this and who are having these conversations on the ground every day as people with that lived experience. And I'm gonna sort of share another, like, I'm in like big anecdote mode today. Some days I'm more anecdotal than others. But last weekend, my building had 2 fire alarms in one night. It was not great. But I never remember my dreams. But of course, because of the fire alarms, I remember them. The first one, I dreamt that there was a fire, which was probably me hearing the fire alarm. But the second one, I don't know where I was, but I was somewhere, and there was a room with an open door that looked like a hotel room probably. And it was just full of actual real people who I know, who are Black Jews, who are rabbis, rabbinical students, in the process of applying to rabbinical school, all of these things. And there was a minyan in that room. And they were just, you know, a couple people were davening together in a corner. Some people were like drinking tea. Everyone was just chatting. And it was just like a lively room. And then I woke up from this dream and was just like, you know, it was like that if you build it, they will come moment. And I just thought to myself, when I started having this conversation a decade ago, that did not exist. None of those people were even in rabbinical school yet. Some of them were still like 14 years old. So it's just amazing to me seeing, on the one hand, the community having the conversation and listening to those of us who have sort of been yelling like, hey, this is what I'm experiencing for like years and years and years. On the other hand, there's like growing cohort of people who are just preparing themselves to lead us, and to really be part of what it looks like to be a Jewish leader, what it looks like to be an active member of a synagogue. Like, it's just so exciting to me. And most of the synagogue conversations I've done lately have had 1 or 2 or more Jews of color. So thank you so much for being here. I'm also always honored when Jews of color come to listen to me ramble about this stuff. So thank you.
Awesome. So while we wait a minute, if anyone else wants to pop up with a question, I'm curious, just as we were coming on, Tema and I were chatting, and she said like she tried to leave official synagogue life, although she's still very much an engaged member of Holy Blossom, and they keep reeling her back in for different things. And she's now chairing the, I don't know if it's officially called the DEI, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Group, but I'm curious what it's like to have a group that's dedicated to issues of diversity and equity in the synagogue. What do they do Do you think that's an effective strategy? Just curious, any insights about that particular focus group?
Sure. So, I mean, I have all sorts of thoughts about like big picture org structure and everything like that. And of course, Holy Blossom's like almost 2,000 families, so it's a very large congregation. But the DEI group, I think right now is actually called the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Working Group or something like that. And it's a standing committee of the membership department. And it came from participating in one of the URJs, like they were partnered with somebody from the Juvenation Fellowship and did a whole audit. What I really love about this group is what we're working on writing the mandate in terms of reference and everything now that the audit is done of the equity and inclusion practices. But this is the committee that looks inside. This is the committee that is tasked with saying, and it's not just about race. So for example, is tasked with saying, hey, wouldn't it be nice if just everyone's pronouns were in their email signature? Great, let's make that a policy for all of the staff to have pronouns in their email signature. So it's like little cosmetic changes, but it's also looking at like who's on the membership materials. Should we have like should we approach diverse families that are like super active and would be happy to tell us about the congregation? Should we do that? So that's been really great to have, and there's like a little bit of structure because the URJ has all the audacious hospitality materials. There is some structure to doing the work. I'm still learning it from the lay leader end, which is kind of nice. The thing I have discovered is that when you're a professional in a synagogue, you have to be really tactful. But when you're a volunteer in a synagogue, you don't have to be tactful anymore. And it's wonderful. I mean, I am by nature a tactful person. This is as blunt as I get. But my biggest suggestion, and I don't know how this is going to play out, I just know synagogue life well enough, is that you need board accountability for this work, because there's only so much that a standing committee can do without the board. Holy Blossom also has an anti-racism committee that is still trying to find its sea legs, but ultimately will likely be doing like reading, like book clubs and education. So like the anti-racism committee would be in charge of like putting on something like this, not the DEI group. I'm trying to make sure those two groups talk to each other, but I think that is a nice structure for synagogues who are trying to do this work. There's all sorts of ways to organize the org chart to make that work, but I think the biggest thing, and like the thing that I have yet to see, is whether this DEI group actually has legs to move policy or not. We will find out. I am prepared to do a lot of work and not have policy happen. Like I know this well enough, but I think, you know, that is the biggest thing. And I think really though, because all of those resources exist in the URJ, I think it's almost a mistake not to experiment with it right now. And what I would suggest is like start with something short term, just getting through the audit, which you can do on your own now. They've published it. And then figuring out of that audit, like what are the priorities, and like maybe it needs committees looking at different areas. Maybe it's one committee, maybe it's one person, maybe it's a staff person. And I think it's going to look different everywhere. I saw a question from Robin in the chat that I just want to answer. So specific practices about creating more hospitality for JOCs. So I think the big one is like just making sure that Jews of color know that they're welcome in your community. And there's no easy way to do that, right? There's always that fine line between tokenizing people and representing people. And one of the things that I always say is that there's, generally speaking, somebody or a handful of people who, I'm being really facetious when I say that, but are like, please tokenize me because I would love to see more people like me here. And they're the people who really see the potential of your community to bring more people from diverse groups in. And they'll be on your membership materials and in your bulletin and whatever else you might have. That's always a really nice way to do it. And then I think it's really just continually sending the message from the leadership, so from the rabbis, from the administration, that like issues around race are important here, and we want Jews of color here and don't know why there aren't a representative number. And the more that comes out, the more people hear it and the more people feel comfortable stepping in. And to tie it again to like the interfaith stuff, one of the things that I hear often is like the most impactful for interfaith families is there was a trend for a while, and it's kind of died down, but it's kind of starting up again, that during Rosh Hashanah or sometimes on Shabbat or something, there will be either a sermon that's basically like thanking the partner from a different background for like committing to Jewish life in that way, like recognizing that it's not a given. And people were like really touched by that. And I don't know what that looks like in terms of like messaging from the pulpit, say, about Jews of color, but just recognizing that when people hear like, hey, we know it's not always easy to show up here and we're trying, I think that goes a really long way. I will say I'm super suspicious of people who think they've got it all sorted out on race or on interfaith families or anything like that, because we're all learning. And I think just that active posture of like, this is an aspirational task. None of us have this solved. And it's going to keep going like that. I don't have all the answers, and like I live it and work it. So I think that's that would be the biggest thing. And then as far as hospitality, just treat the people who do show up as you would treat anyone else. And I always laugh. One of my favorite volunteers, I know I'm not supposed to have favorites, at the first congregation I worked at, came to me all embarrassed one day because she had asked a Black woman who had come to services if she was familiar. It was a Reconstructionist congregation, the only one in the city, so it was the only one that used the Reconstructionist Siddur. And she felt really embarrassed because she had asked this woman if she was familiar with the Siddur. Which is the same thing she asks everyone who comes in who is not a member. And I said, well, and she said yes. I said, okay, but like, did she look taken aback? She said, no. I said, did she thank you? She said, yeah. And I said, well, I mean, she might not have reacted that way. She might have gotten mad, and then you could just say, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean it that way. Like, we're the only one in the city that uses this, and I just wanted to make sure you were comfortable, like explain a little bit, but also like, don't overthink it. It feels weirder when people like overthink it and try to sort of pivot around. And also, you know, the other thing that I always advise people is like, if somebody does get mad at you, know that it's not you, know that it's the 50 people before you who did the thing, and then you were just the one who got the breaking point. So be patient, be optimistic. Yeah.
I also really appreciate what you said about a willingness and just the reality that as part of this conversation, like some of the discomfort is we just don't want to screw up. Like we don't want to offend anybody. We're ashamed of what we don't know. We're ashamed of what we're learning and unlearning and relearning. And but that's how it goes. I mean, there's only one way to get there, and it's going to mean that we all kind of step in it from time to time, but I think that's in service of something far greater.
100%. And, you know, one of my dear friends, Rabbi Ruth Abish-Magder, she has a new title, but she's basically the rabbi in residence at B'chol Lashon. So she does a lot of this work around training. And she came to doing this quite late. Like she just met the executive director of B'chol Lashon, or founder, I can't remember Diane's actual title. This is terrible, I should know these things. And they got to talking, and she was like, wow, this sounds really great. I'd love to learn more and come work. And she said to me that when I was asking her about her work, that the most important thing that she learned how to do was apologize. Nothing else. That was like, and she and I also laughed because she's Canadian also, and I was like, come on, that's in our blood. But you know, but Canadians say sorry. Like the joke is that a Canadian will like walk into an inanimate object and apologize. Like it's like a reflex for us.
Sorry.
Yeah, we say sorry to everything. Like, you know, when you do like the little dance of like who's walking in what direction, we all apologize. Like it's like bizarre. There's great mashups of Justin Trudeau saying sorry in Parliament, and they'll like go on for an hour. Anyhow, but you know, really learning to truly like pause and apologize, because when it's like flippant, like, oh, I'm sorry, people know that that's not a serious apology, but actually taking that time to like listen and acknowledge the harm, which isn't easy, because humans who are like good people with compassion and empathy don't like to hurt other humans. That's just not a thing that we like to do, and we like to try and explain what we meant and what we didn't mean. But at the end of the day, just learning, and I'm terrible at it, like I think most of us are terrible at it, not get defensive, not get flippant, and just like sit with the discomfort and really truly apologize.
That is some deep Torah. Anyone else want to jump in with a question or a comment? Doing the teacher thing and waiting. All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for your presence and participation tonight, but really thank Tema for coming and sharing your heart, your own story, your incredible insights that you've gained over a lot of years of work in this community, seen and unseen. And we are really so fortunate to be the beneficiaries of that, and just to continue to inspire us. I loved your Hanukkah tie-in, that we are, each one of us has the capacity to be a shamash, and we do that one candle at a time, one person at a time, one family at a time, one story at a time, one moment at a time. So I'm wishing everybody a happy Hanukkah. Thank you, Tema. And for Beth Meyer folks and Raleigh-based folks, we have a bunch of other really special things happening for Hanukkah over the next couple of nights. So check out the website, register so we know you're coming, and invite everyone to be a part of it. Thank you so much for being here. Happy Hanukkah, everyone.